Welcome to the Crime Secrets Case House today. We will take a closer look at the events and case caused by a man whose schemes could make even the devil seem innocent. Matthew Barrett sat in his sleek downtown office, staring out at the sprawling cityscape of Chicago. The skyline, with its glass towers reaching toward the sky, mirrored his own life, a perfectly constructed facade. Meticulously built from the ground up at 45, Matthew had everything he could ever want. A successful career as a corporate attorney at one of Chicago's most prestigious law firms, wealth, and a beautiful wife. But beneath the surface, his life was far from perfect. His marriage to Claire had grown cold over the years. What had once been a passionate love had become little more than a business arrangement. Claire had supported him as he climbed the social ladder, hosted dinner parties for his clients, and managed their home with grace, but now they barely spoke outside of obligatory social events. The spark had long since faded, and Matthew found himself restless, longing for something new. That something had come in the form of Lisa Connors, a younger, vibrant woman who worked as a pargal at his firm. Lisa was everything Claire wasn't. Any more exciting, adventurous, and unattached, their affair had started 6 months ago. A whirlwind of late-night tryst and stolen weekends. For the first time in years, Matthew felt alive again. Lisa was exciting, unpredictable, and unburdened by the responsibilities that came with marriage. But as Matthew's feelings for Lisa deepened, so did his desire to be free of Claire. He began to envision a future with Lisa. A future where Claire was no longer in the picture. There was just one problem. Divorce. Matthew knew that Claire would never agree to a divorce easily, and if she did, it would cost him dearly, with no prenuptial agreement in place. Claire was entitled to half of everything, his assets, his earnings, their home. He couldn't bear the thought of losing it all, so he devised a plan. If he could prove that Claire had been unfaithful, the divorce would go in his favor. No alimony, no division of assets, but Claire was loyal, a woman of integrity. She would never cheat on him unless he gave her a reason to. Matthew had always believed that every problem had a solution, and in this case the solution was James Cavanagh. James was not a conventional criminal, but he operated in the shadows, doing the kind of work that required discretion and a flexible moral code. James had a reputation for being able to solve problems that others couldn't, whether it was finding compromising information on a business rival or, in this case, seducing a married woman. Matthew knew James through an associate at his firm. They met in secret at an upscale bar on the city's north side where the dim lighting and background noise offered privacy. James was smooth, handsome, and most importantly, discreet. He exuded the kind of charm that could disarm one, a quality Matthew needed if this plan was going to work. As they sat over drinks, he laid out his plan. He explained that he wanted a divorce if he could do it on his terms. Play is the key. He sent a file across the table. You to seduce her, get her to cheat, and then provide me with proof, photos, texts, anything I can take to court. James raised an eyebrow, flipping through the file that contained information about Claire, her routine, her favorite places, the coffee shop she frequented every morning. You've done your homework, he said, impressed, but are you sure you want to go through with this? Once we start, there's no going back. Matthew didn't hesitate. I'm sure I want out of this marriage, and this is the only way the deal was struck. James would work his way into CLA's life, seduce her, and provide Matthew with the evidence he needed to file for divorce without losing everything. James was a master of manipulation, and he knew how to play the long game. He didn't rush things. With CLA instead, he made sure their first meeting seemed completely organic. One morning, as CLA said at her favorite coffee shop, reading a design magazine, James casually approached her, striking up a conversation about the latest architectural trends. It wasn't forced. It felt natural, as though two strangers were simply bonding over a shared interest. Claire was polite but guarded. She had grown accustomed to the admiration of men, though it rarely held her attention anymore. But there was something different about James. He was charming, yes, but also thoughtful in a way that Matthew hadn't been in years. He listened when she spoke, asked questions about her work as an interior designer, and made her feel noticed. Over the next few weeks, James carefully orchestrated more chance encounters. He would show up at the same events, Claire attended always with a smile and a kind word. It wasn't long before they exchanged phone numbers. Claire, feeling isolated in her marriage, found herself drawn to James's warmth and attention. She began texting him late at night, sharing thoughts and feelings she hadn't voiced in years to her friends, women like Sophie and Lauren, who had known her for over a decade. Claire appeared lighter, happier. Sophie, who had always sensed the strain in Claude's marriage, noticed the change. "First, you seem different," Sophie remarked one evening during their weekly dinner. "Like you're glowing. What's going on?" CLA hesitated, her cheeks flushing slightly. "It's nothing," she said, but the secret smile on her lips told a different story as the wee weeks turned into months. Claire's connection with James deepened. He was always there, offering compliments, making her laugh, and slowly but surely filling the emotional void that Matthew had left. James was patient, never pushing her, always letting her come to him. It wasn't long before Claire found herself fantasizing about a life with James, one where she wasn't just a neglected wife, but a woman desired and valued. It was inevitable. After months of flirting late night and stolen moments, Claire finally crossed the line one evening. After too many glasses of wine at a gallery opening, she and James found themselves alone on the rooftop terrace, the city lights twinkling below. Claire, emboldened by the wine and the thrill of the moment, leaned in and kissed him. The kiss was tentative at first, but when James responded, it became something more. In that instant, Claire forgot about Matthew, forgot about her marriage, and gave in to the past. She had been denying herself for so long. From that night on CLA, and James's affair intensified, they met in secret at hotels in James's downtown apartment, and even in the very coffee shop where they had first met. Claire, who had always prided herself on her loyalty, now found herself lying to her friends, to Matthew, and to herself. But she couldn't stop. James had awakened something in her, and for the first time in years, she felt alive. But James wasn't just playing a role anymore. What had started as a job, an assignment to seduce CLA for Matthew's benefit, had become something more. James found himself genuinely attracted to Claire, drawn to her warmth and vulnerability. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected to fall for her. As the affair continued, James began to question his own motives. Could he really go through with Matthew's plan now that he had feelings for CLA? Could he betray her, knowing how much she had already been hurt by her marriage, despite his growing feelings for CLA? James knew he had a job to do. He had promised Matthew evidence of the affair, and now that CLA had fully crossed the line, it was time to deliver. Over the next few weeks, James carefully documented their relationship, texts, photos, and even recordings of their intimate moments. When Matthew received the first batch of evidence, he felt a surge of triumph. Everything was going according to plan. He had the proof he needed, and soon, he would be free of Claire. But as he scrolled through the photos of Claire and James together, a strange sensation gripped him. It wasn't satisfaction or relief, but something closer to jealousy. This was what he had wanted, wasn't it, for CLA to fall into someone else's arms so he could walk away clean? And yet seeing her with another man, seeing her happy, bothered him in a way he hadn't anticipated. Still, Matthew pushed those feelings aside. He had come too far to back out now. With the evidence in hand, he proceeded with the divorce. His lawyer, Alan Draper, a ruthless litigator with a reputation for winning high-stakes cases, assured him that the evidence would be more than enough to secure an easy victory in court. "We'll file on grounds of infidelity." Alan said during one of their meetings with these photos and messages, "There's no way she'll get alimony or significant share of the assets." Matthew nodded, feeling a sense of control return. "Good. I want this over as quickly as possible." When Claire was served the divorce papers, she was blindsided. She knew her affair with James was dangerous, but she had never imagined that Matthew would go to such lengths to catch her in the act. The divorce, as planned, moved swiftly. Matthew's evidence ensured that Claire received nothing from the settlement. Humiliated and heartbroken, Claire signed the papers. Lisa Connor had been everything Matthew wanted. Fun, exciting, and most importantly, unattached. Their affair had been exhilarating, a welcome escape from the monotony of his marriage. But as the months went on, Lisa began to see things differently. The idea of Matthew leaving his wife for her had initially been thrilling. But as the reality of it set in, Lisa's feelings started to shift. She didn't want to be part of a messy divorce. She didn't want to be the reason Matthew's life fell apart. More importantly, she didn't want to inherit the baggage that came with his crumbling marriage one evening. After a tense dinner where Matthew had once again brought up their future together, Lisa finally said what had been on her mind for weeks. "I don't think this is going to work, Matthew," she said, her voice calm but firm. Matthew looked at her, confused. "What are you talking about? I'm leaving Claire. We can finally be together." Lisa shook her head. "I thought that's what I wanted too, but I don't want to be part of this mess. You're married, Em. Your life is complicated, and I don't want that. I don't want to be your next wife." Matthew felt the ground shift beneath him. "But you said I know what I said." Lisa interrupted, her voice softening. "But I've changed my mind. I care about you, but I can't be in the middle of this. I need to move on." Within days, Lisa was gone. She quit her job at the firm, changed her number, and disappeared from Matthew's life as quickly as she had entered it. For the first time in months, Matthew found himself completely alone. Lisa was gone, and without her, his desire to leave CLA no longer made sense. The life he had imagined with Lisa, a fresh start, a new beginning, had vanished, and now all he had left was the wreckage of his marriage. Desperate and filled with regret, Matthew decided to go back to CLA. He would apologize, beg for her forgiveness, and try to rebuild what they had lost after all. CLA had always been loyal, and despite everything, there was still a part of him that cared for her. He could fix this. He had to, but when Matthew returned home, he found the house empty. Claire's belongings were gone, and the rooms echoed with an eerie silence. Confused, he called her phone, but it went straight to voicemail. Hours passed with no word from her, and finally, Matthew drove to the one place he thought she might be, James's apartment. When he arrived, what he found shattered him. CLA had fallen in love with James. What had started as a game for James, a job to seduce a woman for another man's gain, had turned into something real. Claire had discovered in James everything she had been missing in her marriage, a man who truly cared for her, who listened to her, who made her feel alive again. And James, despite his initial intentions, had found himself falling for Claire in return. In the aftermath of the divorce, Claire left Matthew for good and moved in with James. She had lost the battle legally, but emotionally, she had won. She was free from Matthew's control, and for the first time in years, she was truly happy. When Matthew saw them together, his world collapsed. He had hired James to seduce CLA, to break up his marriage, and now the man he had used as a pawn had taken everything from him. The betrayal cut deeper than anything he had ever felt. Claire was gone, and not only that, she was happy, happier than she had ever been with him. Matthew couldn't accept it. He wouldn't accept it. And as the days turned into weeks, his anger festered, growing into something darker, more dangerous. Matthew's mind spiraled. The loss of CLA, compounded by Lisa's departure, left him broken, humiliated, and consumed by rage. He had always been a man of control, but now everything was slipping through his fingers. His social circle, once filled with admiration for his success, now whispered behind his back, speculating on the collapse of his marriage and the scandals surrounding Claude's new relationship. He couldn't stand it. The thought of Claire and James together, living the life he had once envisioned for himself, was too much to bear. His thoughts grew darker, more violent. He began following them, watching from a distance as they built their new life together. He saw them laughing at cafes, holding hands in the park, and every time he saw them, the anger inside him grew. It was only a matter of time before that anger turned into action. One night, after hours of drinking, Matthew made the decision that would seal his fate. He couldn't let them get away with it. Not Claire, not James. They had taken everything from him, and now it was time to take something back. Armed with a gun he had purchased months earlier for protection, Matthew drove to their home. His hands trembled on the steering wheel as he parked down the street, watching the house from the darkness. Lights were on inside, and he could see their silhouettes through the curtains moving about the house, unaware of what was about to happen. In a blind rage, Matthew stormed up to the door and kicked it in. Claire screamed when she saw him, her eyes wide with fear. James moved to protect her, but Matthew was faster. The gunshot echoed through the house, and James fell to the floor. Blood pooling around him, Claw's scream pierced the air, but Matthew barely heard it. He stood over James's body. The weight of what he had done settling in there was no going back now. As CLA collapsed to the floor, sobbing, Matthew dropped the gun and stumbled out of the house. His mind numb, he had lost everything, and now there was nothing left. Detective Alex Monroe had been on the force for over 20 years, and in that time he had seen his fair share of domestic tragedies, but something about this case struck him differently. The murder of James Kavanagh at the hands of Matthew Barrett wasn't just a crime of passion, it was the culmination of months, maybe even years of carefully orchestrated manipulation and betrayal. As the lead detective on the case, Monroe was tasked with piecing together the events that had led to the murder. The story that unfolded was almost too twisted to believe Matthew, a respected attorney, had hired James to seduce his wife, only for James to fall in love with Claire and marry her, the affair, the divorce, and now the murder. It all seemed like something out of a noir film. Monroe and his team conducted extensive interviews with Matthew's and CLA's friends, many of whom were shocked by the events, but admitted that the Barrett marriage had been strained for years. Alan Draper, Matthew's lawyer, was also interviewed, though he refused to discuss the details of Matthew's divorce strategy, citing attorney-client privilege. Still, the evidence against Matthew was overwhelming. There were the text messages between him and James outlining the plan to seduce CLA, as well as the witness testimony from neighbors who had heard the gunshot and seen Matthew fleeing the scene. The case quickly made its way to court, where Matthew's defense team attempted to argue that he had acted in a fit of temporary insanity, but the prosecution, led by Assistant District Attorney Rachel Cross, painted a different picture. They argued that Matthew had meticulously planned the entire ordeal, and when it had spiraled out of his control, resorted to murder to regain the power he had lost. The jury deliberated for only a few days before returning with a guilty verdict. Matthew Barrett was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. In the end, Matthew's carefully constructed plan had left him with nothing. Lisa was gone. Claire was a widow, and James was dead. The life Matthew had envisioned, a life of control, success, and power, had crumbled before his eyes, now sitting alone in his prison cell. Matthew had all the time in the world to reflect on the choices he had made. He had once believed that he could manipulate anyone, bend people to his will, and control the outcomes of his life. But in his quest for control, he had lost everything that mattered. His friends, his reputation, his freedom, it was all gone. This case showed us all how much harm devilish plans made without sufficient thought can cause. Thank you for watching. If you enjoy this kind of content, you can subscribe to the channel